President Donald Trump said recently that U.S. is sending Ukraine badly needed Patriot air defense missile to help it fend off Russia's intensifying aerial attack. But meanwhile, among the Republican supporters, for example, Republican Senator from Wyoming John Barrasso strongly believe it is time that U.S. should also place more sanctions on Russia, and President Trump couldn't afford to waste any minute to make the message clear to Putin. Another strong advocate for Ukraine, who is U.S. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, said recently during the interview that people should pay attention for President Trump's announcement. And I quote, "The game regarding Putin's invasion of Russia is about to change. For 6 months, President Trump tried to entice Putin to the table. The attacks have gone up, not down. One of the biggest miscalculation Putin has made is to play Trump," end quote. How do we understand the words from President Trump at this moment? And also, despite all the strong rhetoric from the White House, what do we know about the reaction from Putin? And how about China? Remember, China is no longer just a bench player. China is also paying closer attention to the war in Ukraine, specifically this diplomatic and the personal relationship with Russia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is an American historian and a political scientist. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New York, New Jersey, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Professor Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me, Will, and thank you. Thanks to your audience for listening.
Well, it's always a pleasure and honor to have you back on the show, sir. Now, Dr. Motyl, I want to get started. Based on the latest statement, as I mentioned in the intro, President Trump said the U.S. is sending more Ukraine badly needed Patriot air defense missile to help fend off Russia's intensifying aerial attacks. And also, we've heard the statement from Lindsey Graham and also other Republican senators. Let's start with a fundamental question. Is Trump getting tired of the whole waiting game of Putin? And also, as Senator Lindsey Graham mentioned, did Putin actually play Trump well this time? What do you think?
Well, with regard to Putin, he's a little easier to understand. So let me talk about him first, and then I'll talk about Trump. Putin has his agenda. And the agenda has been very clear since day one of the war, and that is that Russia will settle for nothing less than for Ukraine's capitulation, defeat, and transformation into a vassal state of Russia. He's also been pursuing a targeted campaign of killing civilians, which can qualify as genocide, but in any case is certainly a war crime, crime against humanity. And he's been perfectly open about this. So the amazing thing is that Americans, or for that matter anybody else, could have believed for however long that Putin was open to serious negotiations that would have entailed compromise and some kind of more or less just resolution of the war. Even when, in the last 2-3 months, when the Trump administration was more actively engaged and the president called Putin and they had conversations and there were meetings between Steve Witkoff and the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov and so on. Even during all these attempts to get on Putin's good side, to make it attractive for him to negotiate in good faith, Putin responded, as you said, by increasing the bombardments, by increasing the killing, and by hardening his position. But as I said, this is no surprise. We can talk about this later as to why Putin is unwilling to change his position. But the fact is, he's made it very clear since day one that his position is Ukraine's complete destruction as a nation and its transformation into a vassal state. The amazing thing is that Mr. Trump, President Trump, appears finally to have understood that Putin was not a serious negotiator. It took him 6 months, arguably more than that, if you look back in time, for him to appreciate that one cannot talk to Mr. Putin. He doesn't understand negotiations except from a position of dominance and strength, in which case he insists on having his maximalist goals being met. He has no interest in compromise. He has no interest in Ukraine's survival in any kind of form. And again, as I said, this has been perfectly clear. And remarkably, the Trump administration, in its initial attempts, rather than applying sticks and carrots to both Ukraine and Russia, the Trump administration applied sticks to Ukraine and carrots to Russia, which, if you think about it, makes no sense in terms of negotiations. You should always have both. And in Russia's case, a negotiation that lacks sticks is simply doomed to failure. So what seems to have happened in the last 2-3 months is that while on the one hand, Trump has made all of these efforts to approach and satisfy Putin's demands, he's bent over backwards to make, to encourage Putin to agree to something, to anything. So while Trump is doing that, Putin is responding by thumbing his nose at Trump. And instead of talking or acting in a peaceful manner, he simply increased the horrific costs of the war by bombing civilian populations all throughout Ukraine. And it seems to be the case that Mr. Trump has finally understood that Putin has been playing him, has been taking him for a fool, quite simply. Now, we don't know for sure, because Trump has a tendency to change his mind. But based on what he's said over the last week and a half, based on what he said today or yesterday about delivering patriots, and based on the expectation that he will make a significant announcement, which will, among other things, entail the sale of patriots to the Europeans, who then would deliver them gratis to the Ukrainians. So it's a win-win-win. The Ukrainians get patriots, the Europeans are actively involved, and the United States gets money for its weapons. Now, in all likelihood, it won't just be patriots, it'll be other weapon systems as well. And it could be the case, as Senator Graham and others have suggested, that these weapons could be game changers. One hopes that they will. I mean, at a minimum, the destruction wreaked by the Russian bombardments on a daily basis will either be stopped or reduced significantly. That alone would be an enormous achievement, simply because it will save lives of innocent men, women, children. Conceivably, depending on what kind of weapons are delivered, how much, when, and so on, these deliveries could enable the Ukrainians to stop the Russian advances. The Russians have been advancing very minimally, the equivalent of, I read someplace, of an airport on a weekly basis, which is not a lot. But that said, they have been advancing, and they have been doing so in the expectation and hope that they'll be able to capture more and more of Ukraine. If the Ukrainians could stop those advances, that would be excellent. And it would also give Putin, finally, a reason perhaps to negotiate in good faith. If the Ukrainians could not just stop the advances, but even in some places reverse them, I'm not talking about a major advance and a recapturing of all the territories, but just some pushback. That would be even better, and that would signal to Putin, but it would also signal to the Russian elites, many of which are very unhappy about the war, that Ukraine will not go down in flames, that it has the support of the United States and Europe, and that it's high time for Russia to start thinking seriously about negotiations. That is now possible. Whether it'll happen, well, we'll see, of course, based on what Trump decides to do. But it's suddenly become a possibility. And that possibility opens up another possibility, namely that it's conceivable that the war could actually end. Not tomorrow, but perhaps by the end of the year. That would be great news for everybody. Thank you.
Well, indeed, Professor Motyl, that will be a wonderful news for the entire world. But before we get there, let's talk about another piece of reality. President Trump has been clear about what he would do if Vladimir Putin did not agree to end the war. It's simply we're looking at the reality that Putin does not play by the game. And also, Trump promised to impose crippling secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia and give Ukraine more weapons than they ever received. Now, I want to bring China into our conversation. We know that, Dr. Motyl, you and I, we had multiple conversations, especially regarding the relationship between China and Russia. Now, specifically, you know this better than I do, that China has been one of the major buyers and purchasers of Russia's oil. So which means, hypothetically, if President Trump were to play tariffs upon not only Russia, but also on the countries that who actively purchase oil out of Russia, and the countries will also face major punishment as well. So right now, it's not just a game between Russia and the US anymore. It's actually involved more players. So Dr. Motyl, I want to get your reaction and also your interpretation. What does that signify to China at this moment if Donald Trump or President Trump decides to place sanctions or even harsher punishment now on Russia and also all the other countries that will continue this economic relationship with Russia? Your thoughts?
Well, again, we don't know whether he'll impose those tariffs, but assuming that he does, in whichever form, the signal to China would be very, very clear. Namely, this is a war that Russia will not win. And this is a war that will, the effects of which could be very punishing for you, for China, if we're serious about these tariffs. Because, of course, the tariff question, tariffs have already been imposed on China and there are ongoing negotiations. But this would hurt the Chinese economy very strongly because it would address energy, oil, gas, and things like that. So it's conceivable, right? It's conceivable that the Chinese will understand that the United States is finally getting serious about supporting Ukraine. But of course, that understanding depends on what Trump actually does. If he imposes tariffs and they're severe, maybe not 500%, or whatever the amount would be, that would send a very clear and very obvious signal to the Chinese. If the tariffs are small, selected, then that would also send a signal to the Chinese, namely the United States isn't really serious about ending the war, regardless of who wins or who loses. What's interesting is, you may recall a week or two ago, the Chinese foreign minister in a meeting with the European official, Kaja Kallas, is reported to have told her that China can't afford that Russia loses, because that would then enable the United States to focus all its energies on China. Personally, I'm not persuaded that that's the problem for China at the moment. The United States is obviously a problem, and it will remain a problem for China, just as China is and will remain a problem for the United States. But my thinking is that Wang Yi was not quite being honest with Madame Callas. Because in reality, the main problem for China at the moment is Russia. It's not America's responses, because we know what those responses are. It's Russia. And if you think about the three possibilities of how the war could end for Russia and what they imply for China, then we begin to see that Wang Yi may have been dissembling. Consider the following. Russia could win, Russia could lose, or Russia could simply emerge in weakened condition. I think those are three, more or less three mutually exclusive outcomes. If Russia wins, that will make it arrogant, that will make it inclined to impose its own terms on its partnerships with China. And in other words, that will make Russia a far more complicated and difficult partner for China than it is at present. If Russia loses badly, then it's conceivable that Putin will collapse, that his regime will collapse. It's also conceivable that Russia could collapse. That would herald enormous instability in Eurasia. And as we know, the one thing that the Chinese really hate is instability, especially next door. So the ideal for China is not that Russia not lose or that Russia not win. It's for Russia to emerge weakened, which it already is, namely a weakened Russia, which remains more or less stable, is a Russia that could easily be controlled or at least dominated by China. And that would be the ideal circumstance for China. It would also be, in some ways, the ideal outcome for the United States and the West. Russia gets bloodied, it retreats, it abandons some of its imperialistic ambitions, but at the same time, it continues to exist, and we don't have to worry about civil wars, loose nuclear weapons, and things like that. So my guess, and this is just a guess, is that Wang Yi was actually signaling to the West that China's interests vis-a-vis Russia are actually quite similar to those of the West. I may be wrong, of course, but it occurs to me that he must appreciate that China, the best kind of partner that anyone would want, is a weak partner. Because if you have a strong partner, that just means trouble. And if you have a dying partner, that just means trouble as well.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let me read another statement or a social media post written by former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, and we know that he's also a strong advocate for the war, to end the war in Ukraine, and also to understand the complication of the war. This is what he wrote on social media, and I quote, "Putin is making it very clear that any truce in Ukraine will come only when he is defeated. We talk, he killed Ukrainians. We talk some more, he kills more Ukrainians. And he has openly said he wants to destroy Ukraine, and that is his war aim." And also he went on to wrote, "Only then will a ceasefire be possible." Now, Professor Motyl, let's talk about the part that you didn't get a chance to elaborate initially. What is the goal? I mean, we understand the goal that Putin trying to accomplish, but at this moment, I think it is fair to say that Putin it's actually walking in a thin ice at this moment. Because again, Donald Trump, we know it's unpredictable, but by making Donald Trump angry or shaming Donald Trump in a dramatic way, this is not a pretty picture for the White House. So the question to you is, what is the goal that Putin trying to accomplish in the end? But because right now, people are getting tired of the war. Trump is getting tired of being questioned by the media or being questioned by, we say, international friends or foes and whatever you call it. And also recently he made a strong statement that it's not U.S. the job to finish the war. It's actually Europe need to step up to continue to play or to support Ukraine. But again, going back to the question for Russia, for Putin, what is he trying to accomplish? How do we know that he will face the truth one day, or hopefully the day will come, the day we can see it? Your thoughts?
Well, Putin's primary goal at this point in time is political survival. He's staked his entire career, his entire life, not just political, but natural, on the war. And he's created a difficult situation for himself. He's painted himself into a corner because he's so clearly identified with the war. For him to accept anything short of what he could call a victory, namely some kind of the annexation of the 4 provinces that he partly controls, that would be the minimum. The complete destruction of Ukraine, that would be the maximum. But something along those lines is necessary for him to be able to say, we've lost, at this point, by the way, they've lost 1,250,000 soldiers. So let's say by the end of the year, it's closer to 2 million. That's becoming fantastic. That's simply incredible. It's hard to imagine those sorts of losses in today's world. So for him to be able to justify to Russian elites and to the Russian people that he was able to achieve something for 2 million dead and wounded, he needs to be able to bring something home. At a minimum, as I said, those 4 provinces. At a maximum, the destruction of Ukraine is not within, simply doesn't have the wherewithal. States does indeed supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs, then that becomes perfectly impossible. It also becomes very, very difficult if the US supports Ukraine. It becomes very, very difficult for Putin to capture all 4 provinces. Because if the Ukrainians can stop him, he will be stopped. He will have to be satisfied with the province, with the territories that he currently occupies. That would put him into an extremely precarious and dangerous position. He already is facing major opposition within the Russian elites. The economists who run the economy are openly talking about stagflation. They're talking about the possibility of hyperinflation. They're openly talking about the fact that the economy is in a recession, that Putin has created an enormous deficit. In other words, the economy is becoming unsustainable. The military losses are becoming unsustainable. And Putin is on very thin ice. If he could be stopped at the front, then he'll have nothing to show to Russia for the deaths and the destruction that he's caused, not just to Ukraine, but specifically to the Russians as well. That would weaken his position. And he could then become the target of a coup d'etat, or, hoping to salvage whatever he can, he might be more amenable to some kind of ceasefire. But as Newt Gingrich said, the only way he will ever agree to anything resembling peace, ceasefire, or something in between would be if he faces defeat. As long as he thinks he's winning, he's not, by the way, but he thinks he's winning. As long as he thinks he's winning, he will not sit down at the table and negotiate in good faith.
Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Now, we've been talking about China, we talk about Donald Trump, but let's bring the last person into our conversation, who is the sitting US president of Ukraine. And again, we know that not only that today we're paying closer attention to the announcement that President Trump is yet to make, but also the whole world continue to pay attention to the progress through social media under President Zelensky. Now, at this moment, as you and I were speaking right now, what kind of message does the US send to President Zelensky at this moment? Because remember the White House fallout between Zelensky and President Trump. That was, again, not too long ago, and that was rather embarrassing, or rather, I dare to use the word shameful for the world to watch. But right now, Trump vowed to continue to support Ukraine, and also the two leaders met on numerous occasions. Final question to you, Dr. Motyl. What does the message send to President Zelensky at this moment? Or is Zelensky ready to continue to fight on the war and also understand that U.S. it has always been on the side of Ukraine? Your final thoughts.
He's done a remarkable job in terms of foreign policy. He's criticized by Ukrainians for his internal policies, but that's a different story. When you consider, as you said, that disastrous and shameful encounter in the Oval Office back in February, and compare that to Trump's statements about Zelensky now, or at least within the last several weeks, there's been a 180-degree shift. And I think that's in no small part due to Zelensky, who realized very quickly that regardless of who was right and who was wrong in that particular encounter in the Oval Office, he needed to change his tune. He needed to change his approach to Trump. Basically, he needed to get on his knees and ask him for forgiveness. And even though he didn't quite do that explicitly, he did that metaphorically. He changed his attitude. He changed his tone. He changed his approach to Trump. In other words, and you can see this in the statements, he acknowledges Trump's wisdom. He acknowledges the United States' indispensability. And he always emphasizes the things that matter, especially to Trump. So Zelensky has learned. Whether this change is now going to be permanent, does that mean that Zelensky is now Trump's favorite? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but certainly based on the last few months since February, that shift has occurred, and it's quite impressive. And I think partly it's responsible for Trump's apparent willingness to supply Ukraine with weaponry. The most important factor, as we've already said, is the fact that Putin was playing him for a fool. That addressed Trump's ego. And when you play with Trump's ego, you're always going to lose. But Zelensky was able to take advantage of that. He presented himself in Ukraine as reasonable, as conciliatory, as interested in peace, as wanting to work together with the United States and Trump on some kind of deal. In other words, he presented himself as the exact opposite of Putin. Putin was an unreasonable warmonger, a perpetrator of genocide, doesn't want peace, etc., etc., etc. And in contrast, Zelensky and Ukraine are the peaceful partners of Trump and Ukraine and the United States. And so I think the consequence of that, the result of that, is the apparent willingness of Trump to provide Ukraine with significant weapons. And just today, again, also important as a signal, his special envoy on Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, the general, has just arrived in Kiev, and he's supposed to spend, I believe, close to 7 days. That's serious. Because most people come for a day or two, they look around, they have a few meetings, they talk to the press, and they go home. But 7 days in Kiev means that he's going to be conducting serious and extended conversations with a number of high officials. And that's, again, I think the signal is clear. At this point in time, the United States supports Ukraine, Trump supports Zelensky. Let's hope that remains permanent.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, at this moment, we don't know how President Trump will elaborate his specific announcement regarding the support to Ukraine. And also, the entire world anticipates that the war would end by the end of the year if Putin is to be defeated. Again, there's so much more that we don't know. But again, the bottom line is we are tired of seeing the war, And again, it's time for us to really bring this matter seriously, not just as a country, but also as the whole international community. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl is an American historian. He's a political scientist, and he's a professor of political science, and is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow the latest updates and announcement from President Trump. So thank you so much for doing this.